a month or so to look at the emotional impact of climate disruption and think about how we can help our students cope with eco-grief and hopelessness. So each session has a different theme and facilitator, and we're mainly trying to create opportunities to network and collaborate and share resources while we're building a scholarly community. So if you haven't joined before, just know this is a fairly informal discussion group, and we invite you to jump in and not only ask questions, but also share your own insights and strategies that you use with students in relation to the topic. And I'll help moderate. Hopefully I'll get a video started here again in a moment. But just feel free to either raise your hand or drop a comment in the chat. So I'm excited to introduce our guest host for today, who is Jennifer Ladino. Jen is a professor of English at the University of Idaho and the author of Memorials Matter, Emotion, Environment, and Public Memory at American Historical Sites. That was in 2019. And also the book Reclaiming Nostalgia, Longing for Nature in American Literature from 2012. She also co-edited with Kyle Bladow, Affective Ecocriticism, Emotion, Embodiment, and Environment in 2018. And she's published articles on a range of subjects in the environmental humanities. So at the moment, Jen is working on a collaborative project with some sociology colleagues that I think they're working together to try to understand the emotions behind climate skepticism. And I think she's going to talk a little bit about that today. And she also just noted that for our discussion today, she'd be really eager to hear how others negotiate the relation between fear and anxiety, and on the other hand, positive emotions like hope and resilience and love in their classrooms. So with that, Jen, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. And thanks to you and Sarah for keeping these conversations going. I have found them to be such a bright spot in my days over the past 6 or 8 months, however long it's been. I've lost track of time. But thanks for everyone for being here and taking time out of your busy schedules to join us this morning. I'm going to share my screen here. I do have some slides, and I'm going to be talking about fear and related emotions today. I'm trying to anchor the conversation at first, at least in our pandemic context, which it's been about a year now. And I'll argue for the utility of the emotion of worry in particular, which I'll tell you about in relation to the project Jennifer just mentioned with these two sociology colleagues of mine here at UI, Kristen Haltner and Dilshani Sarachandra. And then I'll end with some questions that I hope will get us thinking about these ideas in relation to our teaching. So I've got Greta Thunberg here because I quote her in that Edge Effects piece. Her quote, "I want you to feel the fear I feel every day," in the short piece that you read. Although she looks more angry, I think, in this photo. This is from the How Dare You address, which is how I like to refer to that one. And then Rachel Carson, of course, on the bottom of the slide here, who may also be feeling some anger. Here she's testifying before the Senate Government Operations Committee in 1963 about pesticide spraying. And I think Silent Spring is a great example of how fear can function in a narrative. I'm thinking of The Fable for Tomorrow, which you probably know, that opens that book, and how combined with other emotions, in that case, nostalgia, fear might be motivating for some audiences. So that's the kind of hypothesis I'm going to ask you to entertain with me today. Thinking about our context a little bit, well, of course, I want to note that I very much trouble the idea of a singular apocalypse when I teach and talk about it with my students. There is a way in which teaching during this past year has felt a little bit more than usual, like living in the end times. So I found myself using a lot of dark humor. I ended up having 2 back-to-back classes on climate change fiction, highlighting the apocalyptic themes, so very timely matter. And yeah, I used some humor. For instance, the Apocalyptimist cartoon there. I put that up there because it's darkly funny, which is the kind of humor I like, but also because it gets at this concept I'm going to talk about in a minute called affective dissonance, kind of holding 2 mixed feelings or contradictory feelings at once. I also really love this Teaching in a Dystopian Hellscape resource, which has tips like, consider doing your weeping while your students are in breakout rooms, which I haven't actually had to do, although I did almost have to do that in a work meeting the other day. So, there's a lot of advantages to teaching on Zoom. So anyway, I drafted the edge effects essay at the front end of this pandemic, so almost a year ago, and I'd been up all night, anxiously worrying, as I am prone to do, and I sort of frantically dashed out that piece in the morning, and Edge Effects was really quick to publish it. And I was trying there to kind of pull together some of the research I'd been planning to share with you in Munich, and of course, mourning the fact that we would not be able to do that in person. And I had been turning back to actually the Memorials book, where I did first start thinking about fear in one of the chapters there. And you saw a little bit of that if you read the Edge Effects piece, this kind of outline of the different ways that fear can function. This is a kind of laundry list of the goals of that project, but I've put the most pertinent two at the top for us. I'm kind of an emotion, I'm kind of the emotion police. I like my students and all of us to be very particular about the emotions and the language that we use to talk about our emotions. I feel like we're very inept and very unnuanced oftentimes, especially in political discourse. And fear, I think, has always struck me as an oversimplified term, especially when we talk about it in our politics. As a basic emotion, fear doesn't seem to me to reflect the way we live in the world, the way we actually experience it. I don't think many of us live in the grips of a purely basic emotion for very long. And so, it tends to settle into something else. This is what I was talking about in that article and in the book, that, it's something CNI might call a non-cathartic emotion that simmers or endures over time. So one of my goals for this brief talk today is just to convince you that we don't need to throw out all fear feelings entirely, but instead think about specific ways that we feel fear and differentiate between them. So again, I'm going to talk about worry in particular and how that might be useful in certain contexts. And so be thinking about that maybe as I talk to you in your own classrooms and with your own students. Sarah did a great job a few weeks ago or months ago of telling us about or getting us thinking about our different student demographics and what they need that's maybe different, right? So think about your own students as I talk to you. So affective dissonance, just very quickly, this is a concept from the Memorials book that I find myself thinking about a lot during the pandemic in particular. And I define it as this kind of unsettling but very common experience of holding within ourselves, within our bodies, two or more conflicting emotions at once. So for instance, this is a photo from Manzanar, where as a tourist, I felt both the attraction and joy and awe of the Sierra, the mountain range. For me as a former mountaineer, that's a positive emotion, but also a sense of anxiety looking up at this reconstructed guard tower, or sadness and regret when you're thinking about the trauma that happened here to real people, or claustrophobia in entering the reconstructed barracks that they've produced there. So a kind of conflicting positive and negative state. So I argue that we feel this in our day-to-day lives too, and you can correct me if I'm wrong or tell me about your own affective dissonance stories later. During the pandemic, I find myself feeling a lot of kind of low-grade anxiety, even dread on some days, but also, moments of joy and wonder at other times, getting out for a hike on our local mountain with one of my kids. And neither one of those feelings displaces the other one entirely, right? We can hold these contradictions within us. And so I remind my students a lot, and myself, that the word emotion carries etymologically this connotation of kind of movement and agitation. And so in a sense, I think emotions are always a little bit anxious or unsettling. So here we're going to get in the weeds with some definitions, which I hope you'll enjoy as much as I do. I love to kind of nerd out over the nuances of emotion words. And you'll see that Panu is quoted here, our climate justice educator colleague, who I've been really inspired by. And so, we all know kind of how fear tends to be defined here. Anxiety, I think, has a longer duration, and it's notorious in affect studies for not necessarily always having a clear object. And that's kind of important for how I'm using the term worry here. You can think about the American Psychological Association's eco-anxiety, or Sarah Jaquette Ray's climate anxiety as particular pertinent kinds of anxiety for our conversation. And then dread, I think, is a heavier, more intense version of anxiety. You can think about Glenn Albrecht's global dread in his new book, Earth Emotions. But it's worry that really interests me here. It's often used as a synonym for anxiety, but if anxiety is this background feeling or non-cathartic affect that doesn't have an easily identifiable object, worry actually does, right? So worry, I'm understanding as a kind of troubled, or unsettled mental state that is not reducible to anxiety. And here I do align myself with Panu and also with the new work of Susan Clayton and Brian Carazia on climate change. I don't think I have their citation there, but I can get it for you. But they suggest that worry has a less serious impact on individuals. And so I'm going to cite a couple things from the Smith and Lieserwitz 2014 study. They are among several studies I've seen that suggest that compared to fear, which they say causes an amygdala hijack, I love that phrase, and lead to disengagement, avoidance, doubt, all of these things that Sarah and others have pointed out are problematic. Compared to that, worry, they say, is, quote, a less intense emotion better suited to the issue of climate change. Worry tends to motivate, not short circuit, more intense cognitive and analytical processing of risk information. That's their quote. And then one more quote from them: provided they are calibrated to be neither too mild nor too intense, appeals to worry can motivate and promote the kind of deliberative and iterative decision-making climate change requires. Okay, so that's the end of my quoting from Smith and Lieserwitz, sorry. And then the phrase objects of care that you can see here on the slide in my definition of worry comes from Susie Wang et al. In 2018. Their citation is on the bottom there. And they use it to refer to the valued objects that climate change threatens. So instead of climate change itself being an object of care, we care about the things that it impacts, the people, the places, the species. And so I'll talk about that more in just a second in my work with my colleagues in sociology. That project that I'm working on, that's marked with the blue arrow on this slide, is part of a series of projects that I've helped start under the University of Idaho's Confluence Lab, which is a new research lab that I launched 2 years ago with my colleague in English, Erin James, and my colleague in geography, Teresa Cohn. She's in the College of Natural Resources. So it's an interdisciplinary lab that puts humanities and social sciences at the table together with other scientists. We also have several community-oriented public-facing projects, and it's taken off really fast. We just launched in March of 2019, so we're coming up on our 2-year anniversary of sort of officially being a thing. And our projects are really wide-ranging. We have musicians and filmmakers and photography and quantitative and qualitative sociologists, science communication specialists, and of course, literary studies folks. I've been in this week working on these National Science Foundation workshops, which are being held down in McCall, 3.5 hours south of me, and I'm doing them on Zoom. Erin, my colleague, is also doing them on Zoom, Erin James. And we've put narratology, I can talk about this later if you want, at the center of that National Science Foundation work. It's super interesting. We're trying to enhance informal education on fire ecology with attention to storytelling and narrativity, as well as affect and emotion theory. So that's going really well. And I'm reading interviews with 40 folks who've been impacted by fire in some way, and those are super interesting. So we can talk about that more later. Our most exciting new project, which we haven't even begun to really implement yet, is funded by the Mellon Foundation, and we're working with the University of Oregon on a Pacific Northwest Just Futures Institute for Racial and Climate Justice. And Whitman College is also a partner on that. So keep us in mind if you know of PhD students in geography or critical cartography, preferably with GIS training and Indigenous or Latinx expertise, who could join our Idaho team. I'll be writing up a more official recruiting blurb soon, but do keep in mind that we have this work going and we will be recruiting at least one student to work on that. Okay, so I want to tell you a bit about the Nature and Nuance of Climate Change Perceptions project just quickly and tell you about why worry matters for understanding climate skepticism. So my colleagues, Kristen and Dolshani, had been working on this before they learned about the Confluence Lab, and they heard us talking at our opening launch event about emotions, and they grabbed me afterwards and like, we need you to work on our team because we're trying to understand the emotional dimensions of skepticism. So I can't do justice to their work. Please check out Contexture. They've got probably a dozen articles by now that are based on these 33 interviews and 1,000 surveys with self-identified climate skeptics who live in this region of the US Pacific Northwest. And they've found, for instance, that skeptics have a considerable amount of pro-environmental support for pro-environmental policies, things like pollution and alternative energy sources, reforestation. These things resonate with a large chunk of people who are skeptical. And I'll talk more about that in a second. So I did provide input on the survey design for those 1,000 surveys and helped with the emotion language in particular. I also helped sort of close read the interview responses and the parts of the survey where people talked about how they feel about climate change. And so, and this is, this little chart I'm not going to talk about, but they're working on adding nuance to existing typologies of climate skepticism. So for example, there's a difference between a doubter who believes climate change is not happening and a denier who thinks climate change is happening, but it's not human caused. And so they've got, at least 4 different ways of conceiving of skepticism. That's really important, I think, to flesh out. But for our article, which is currently under review, we've found that skeptics do tend to pin worries on specific objects. They think a lot about pollution, threats to non-human animals, and they dread bigger, more existential threats, such as big environmental disasters, threats to our own species and to the planet itself. So it does kind of align with the worry and dread distinction that I make in the literature review, which was mostly what I wrote of the article. Dilshani is a quantitative sociologist, and so she does all the number stuff that I don't understand super well. And then Kristen is a qualitative sociologist, and the line between her discipline and mine, I think, is the most kind of rich and blurry and interesting. So these concerns exist, this is the important piece, even for skeptics who don't believe in anthropogenic climate change, right? And so, what was I going to say? So, yeah, so I think this kind of hammers home the point that I've been thinking about and making for a long time, but without any scientific evidence, which is that when we clarify what emotions mean and how they're different from each other, we get a clearer picture of how, in this case, skeptics feel about climate change and what objects they actually care about. So by saying, worry takes this object, let's pinpoint what the objects of care are, we can get a better picture of who these people are and not only how they're feeling in a vague sense, but particularly how they care about. So this is something I want to talk about with you all in terms of our classrooms. Are there activities we do or can start doing that help not only skeptical people, but everybody identify the sort of objects that we care about, and then where do we go from there? Okay, so we could talk more about that study later if you're interested. My contribution to the toolkit, at least what I proposed a few days ago, is that I will frame this kind of theoretical background and then come up with a particular activity that I'm going to do with my particular student demographic here in rural northern Idaho, where my students have told me they appreciate being made to feel fear. They say that it motivates them and they feel it too rarely and they need more of it in their lives. So that may be really different from how your students are feeling. Of course, this was from a class in 2018. I haven't asked my class directly this spring how they're feeling about fear. I have made some changes to my reading list. For example, I subbed out Cormac McCarthy's The Road, which I've been told by one colleague who may be here today was abusive to teach to my students. I think about that a lot. And I took that one off the list and put in Barbara Kingsolver's Flight Behavior, which is much more positive. And I think it allows conversations about both emotions, but also kind of how we come together and talk across different divides, which is important to me. But I think, there's a kind of climate change privilege here that some of my students might be feeling insofar as they don't feel like this is impacting them so much, and it may not. And so they feel removed. And so I think, whereas other people in other places are feeling the impacts already, feeling, constantly in a state of anxiety, my students are not. And so for them, they welcome a little healthy dose of fear. Oh, wow, that's it. Okay, so I think we're going to open it up to some conversation. I think you all have my email address. I left to show off my early National Park Service days and the Smokey the Bear Resist t-shirt, which is a more recent picture. But I want to think with you now about what this all means in our classrooms, right? And so I'll just read through these questions. And I think if it's okay, I wouldn't mind just keeping us all together as a large group today, because I think we all have so much to say and I don't want to miss anything, which happens in the breakout rooms. So I'll just read through these. How have you managed feelings of fear? And I would like to distinguish them, right? Dread, anxiety, worry, maybe I'm missing something else in your own classrooms when those come up. What emotions do they tend to come up with? What do they show up alongside? How do you juggle them? Where, when, and how do you encourage students or leave space for fearful feelings to emerge? Have you done any exercises already that are designed to pinpoint these objects of care that might be triggered by worry? Do your particular students seem like they welcome, avoid, or struggle with feelings of fear? And for which demographics might a healthy dose of fear or worry be a good wake-up call? So there's my email address. And I'll stop sharing, but I can put these in the chat as we have a conversation.
Thank you, Jen. I have a huge list of notes and questions already, as I'm sure everybody else does here in the room. So let's just go ahead and open it up. If you want to raise your hand, or if things get fairly quiet in the hand realm, you can just unmute yourself and jump in. And I'm also happy to facilitate anything that pops up in the chat if you'd prefer to share some of your thoughts that way.
Yeah, I'm getting better at monitoring the chat and talking to the group, but it's still hard to be pulled in two directions sometimes.
Good to have two people on that, so.
April, or can you unmute, or do you want us to read that out loud?
Oh, I can unmute. Oh, sorry. There we go. Hi, y'all.
Hi.
So I typed it just because I wanted to get Jedediah Purdy's language right, because I just think, you know, can't really do better than his writing. But basically, when I was reading his latest book, I was really struck by this description of climate denial, that it's actually not a lack of belief in like the presence of others and the fact that we're networked, and it's really a fear based, that they feel that kind of presence of others so acutely and worry that they'll make claims on him. And so I'm just wondering about, I'm so compelled by your nuancing of fear, because I do think it's so complicated and it's not something that we think about in very complicated ways, or at least that I know of. So I'm just wondering how like your work on fear and the work of your colleagues can help us think about this kind of, you know, anxiety that triggers xenophobia and all the rest.
Yeah, gosh, now I'm wishing that Kristen and Dilshani were here. I'm trying to get them to do a panel with me at ASLE. We might consider that, because they know this work so well, and they know all the nuances in and out, you know, how religion and political ideology and race and gender and all of these sort of identity factors tend to impact people's emotions, right? And I think the Purdy sounds totally on point with what they are finding in their data collection, that it is, you know, they actually argue in one of their pieces, this is again, Christian Haltner and Dilshani Sarachandra, I feel like I'm always quoting, that climate change denial and skepticism could be a kind of exaggerated ostrich effect. That's how they describe it. And this predates my work with them, but that it is a kind of a deep fear potentially, and a kind of repression of that contributes to that kind of denial. Yeah, so that doesn't even begin to answer that question, April, but yeah, you should read some of their work, because they've published a whole bunch of stuff that gets at some of these nuances really well.
Thank you. And that's also a great, ostrich effect is a great phrase for me to look up.
Yeah, I think they call it an exaggerated ostrich effect. And again, their website, I'll just put it here in the chat, is called Contexture, which they named, I can't remember exactly what contexture means. This is newer, but something about intersections and layering, and it dovetails with our Confluence Lab. They consider that their work to be kind of part of the Confluence Lab, or sort of partnering with them, although we do other things, and they focus on the skepticism work. Yeah, thanks, April, great question. Krista, I think, was next, is that right?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm unmuted. That was awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
I wanted to share with this group in general that the Worry and Hope study that I've talked about before is finally published as of Monday. It's been a year and a half. So I'll put the link to that in the chat. But in that paper, I included a table. It's called Spectra of Micro Emotions. And I tried to list the fear emotions, just as you're talking about. And I tried to like rank them, and to argue that, you know, we need to intervene with students or recognize the difference from you know, feeling a little nervous to being paralyzed.
Yeah.
And, you know, it was difficult. And the editors kind of almost didn't let me put the table in. They were like, this is subjective. You can't rank these like this. But I really thought it was important. So maybe that's something we could work on together as a group. And
Yeah.
I was influenced by this, you know, there's research on micro emotions that says if we can pinpoint and identify the emotion that we're feeling, then we can deal with it better. So I really like how you're unpacking the emotion of fear.
Thank you. Yeah, I can't wait to see your work. Please do share it with us. And
It's a short article, and luckily it still feels, I mean, so much has changed even since it was submitted for publication, but it's still pretty interesting.
That's great.
And then I wanted to, in terms of classroom stuff and creating fear emotion and sadness emotion, to do so kind of responsibly. This semester I'm teaching a lot online, and I've been using music, and there's all this climate music. So this could be another great resource. There's several playlists, you know, climate emotion songs. So I've been starting each online week with a song, and really asking them to like go into the emotions. And a song is safe because it's, you know, contained. It's only 4 minutes long. So
we do that too. Yeah, that's so great.
Yeah,
I would love to compare lists with you. And I know April Anson also has an apocalypse sort of soundtrack. And I asked the students to share, and we compile. So yeah, that'd be fun to compare.
Yeah. So I have some other thoughts, but I'll hold on to them. Thank you so much.
And you're speaking to us again soon. Are you going to be talking about similar topics, Krista?
I'm going to be talking about the faculty follow-up study I did after the Worry and Hope study, which was focus groups with students.
Okay.
I
awesome.
realized I needed to talk with faculty. So yeah, that's in April. Thank you so much.
I can't wait. Thank you. Yeah. I'll just show you, since you brought up the chart, I just looked back at that Smith and Lieservitz article, which is old now. I mean, it's 10 years old. And if you look at the Yale climate change data, like people have changed how they feel really pretty dramatically in the last 10 years. And this is an example of an emotion chart, right? So it's, I would say that's not very distinguished at that level of kind of micro emotions. And we, you know, could have done a better job in our 1,000-person survey. I think we only asked about worry and dread. And I think that my colleagues had, they were drawing on other studies, including this one, to kind of think about what they call discrete emotions, which I think is a really interesting term. And I need to talk to them more about this idea of discrete emotions, because I tend to think of emotions as a big mess, right? Like, how do you even tell what a discrete emotion is? Like, they're so complicated, and there's so many going on at the same time. And so this was, you know, just because of time constraints, I haven't had as much time, but to kind of work with them on that. But yeah, I can't wait to see that. Thank you, Krista. Rich, I think, is next.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jen. That was fantastic. I sometimes have misgivings of having been the one to have the hot take that teaching the road is abusive.
That was him. Yes, that was, he's outing himself. Yes.
And you make a good point that that sometimes you need to trigger or provoke a kind of fear within a controlled environment, right? Which, I mean, it's difficult to create that controlled environment. But in any case, that's one thought. A couple of others really quickly. Affective dissonance, the way you deploy it, the way you use it. I've made a lot of use of that in my class on the water crisis.
Yeah.
It's a very useful way to get students to think about the opposite of discrete emotions, which is to say this sort of mixing of contradictory feelings. And I don't know if you all are familiar with the Bureau of Linguistical Reality. This is it's a group that Jason Groves, colleague at UW, introduced me to their work. They coin new terms for our times, right? And one of the terms I find most useful, it refers, so for me, it refers to the feeling of surprise and somatic comfort when you enter the Pacific Ocean in June and it's actually kind of warm. I'm talking about up here in the Pacific Northwest, and that term is blissonance.
Oh yeah,
right. So
I have
it's
seen
this
that
sort of dissonant bliss that you can feel in certain, you know, outdoor settings, we'll call them. And then finally, so I think Krista mentioned this word in that chart that you just pulled up, use it as well. So what I find most often accompanies fear and dread in classroom discussions around, the big topics is sadness. And one of the, I guess one of the questions I have about how we deploy the language of emotions and of affect in the classroom is how we distinguish between, and you seem to be doing this clearly, between non-pathologized emotions and those that appear in the DSM, right? And as a sort of casual reader of the DSM, I found myself reading and rereading the definitions of narcissism beginning in 2016 for obvious reasons. But I think, that chart, it shows that kind of that moment where the sort of popular discourse of emotions begins to tip into the discourse of pathologized emotions, because you have sadness, dread, depression, right? Which is a diagnosable illness.
Anxiety.
How do we wrestle with that? How do we contend with that? Because we have all witnessed, I think, the display of something very worrying in students' responses to some of the texts we're discussing, or the broader topics we're discussing, where we begin to wonder, does somebody need to intervene professionally?
Yeah, that's
a little heavy.
No, that's a great question. And actually, in these National Science Foundation workshops, we realized very quickly that asking people to tell fire stories can be very triggering of traumatic experiences, right? And somehow we hadn't anticipated that. This is more of a practice. This is a very preliminary stab. So we're going to do the real workshops over the summer. We're working with Moss students, McCall Outdoor Science School students on this. And so it was really helpful to be reminded. And I don't have a great answer to that question. If you're asking sort of what do you do when you trigger these emotions? And let me clarify too that I don't go into my classrooms like trying to provoke fear, but I try to acknowledge that it can come up and that it's something we need to not necessarily avoid in my particular context, but we need to be able to talk about. But you're right. I mean, there are going to be students who are going to be triggered by these things. And I would just say quickly, and from a kind of intellectual standpoint, that anxiety is really interesting in this regard. And we actually cite Jennifer's teaching experience with, the snowflake accusation. And my sociologists say that, anxiety is pathologized, not only as a medical problem, but as a political problem, right? This is something that liberal snowflakes suffer from, make liberals cry again, right? It's not a slogan. So yeah, I don't know. I've thought about it more from the intellectual side than the pragmatic in the classroom side. So I would defer to other people on that one. And I don't know if we want to take a minute to hear other people's thoughts about that first. I would be interested. And then I do want to hear Panu's question, since this is right in his area of research. But yeah, how do you all deal with Rich's concern here?
I mean, primarily around sadness. That's the one that I find most.
Yeah. I mean, we have several grief experts, I think, among us.
And I'll just say, so for my own part, the technique, in as much as it is a technique, in the classroom, is to just take a moment. And to let it sit uncomfortably. And I like nature, I abhor a vacuum in discussion. But I've learned to just try to let it, be present, so that other students who have the same response can also reflect upon it. But beyond that, I feel a little lost. Yeah.
I mean, Sarah probably has thoughts on this, right? I know you've struggled for a long time with I'm not a trained therapist, and what's my role here? So I don't know if I don't want to, make you talk, Sarah, but I'd love to hear what you do.
Well, I feel like I was here 2 weeks ago, or 2 sessions ago, and so I've talked a lot then. But on that front, I'm working right now with someone to develop like a professional development workshop for educators around emotion, and besides the sort of, hey, we need to think about, there's so many intellectual things we can do that are not about being a therapist. And I would love to produce, I'm hoping that this Existential Toolkit book that I hope many of you contributed to will be an example of that, right? That we don't have to be therapists to own the fact that our pedagogy has an emotional hidden curriculum, and to use the research on emotions to improve our curriculum and our outcomes for our students. And that's just good teaching. That's not being a therapist. But so thinking around the intellectual assignments, for example, like what Ellen Kelsey would do, she would probably have a lot more assignments on solutions or problem solving or things that train students to feel efficacy or to see themselves in a different story, or there's all different types of things that can be done there. But I think also there's a lot of, if people have the inclination, there's a lot of that are more non-intellectual approaches that more have to do with contemplative practices that people, if they're interested in them, I think it's hard to do if it's not something that you're already interested in doing, or else it will feel forced and imposed. And I have to be frank that it does for me. I have a hard time bringing that into the classroom, even though it's something that I need to do for myself. But there's more affective or things related to the body, somatic, or other kinds of things we can bring to the classroom, and we don't have to be experts on it, although I think the trauma-informed dimensions of that are really important based on what you just said, Jen, about, some of the stuff is triggering. But I really love the kind of thinking about cruel optimism, all the kind of affect theorists that you do, Jen. If you're not feeling like being a therapist, bring all the affect theorists in and say, hey, what kind of cultural or political work does all this emotion do?
Yeah.
And it gives, I think, students a level of it gives them a different access point to self-regulation and not being in their window, outside their window of tolerance or amygdala hijack or whatever you want to call it.
Mm-hmm.
To give them these tools that have some distance. There's in mindfulness, you would just call it some separation from your emotions, the intensity of emotions, so that you can regulate with your parasympathetic nervous system and all that. But we're doing that. We're asking our students to do that when we do things like say, let's critique individualism in American society and how it makes us feel, disempowered and alone and all these sad feelings, right? So unpacking the sadness intellectually, personally, for me, works better as a pedagogy.
Yeah, no, that's exactly how I've done it, Sarah. And that's my comfort zone. That's my training. Like that is what I do. And maybe there is something to it, like the idea that helping students grow their vocabulary for not only understanding emotions, but the objects they take. This is my latest fascination. And I had a kind of epiphany about my nostalgia work, which I've always sort of regretted, I guess, that I didn't know much about affect studies then. And I didn't really treat nostalgia from that framework at all. I treated it as a narrative kind of, a narrative, basically a narrative tone or an approach that authors were taking, and as like a concept. But nostalgia also takes an object. And that was kind of the whole point of the book, is like, what are the objects that nostalgia takes? When we're grieving a loss, when we're missing something, what is that thing, right? And so this is the same thing with worry, is like, if you're worried about something, what is that thing? And can we talk about that object of care, that thing that we value? And so maybe that's kind of one helpful thing that I hope that I'll be doing soon with students, is just being specific. And then they might feel less bad about, oh, I'm anxious, I'm worried, in this vague sense, but more, targeted towards something they can care about and work toward in a kind of pro-social activist way if they want to. So yeah.
And I know Panu's got his hand raised. But
yeah, I know.
One of my aversions to some of the stuff, or the struggle I have, and y'all who are here for my session will be familiar with this, but when the students disagree with each other about what those objects of care ought to be based on kind of their background or positionality or their politics, that's where I struggle as an instructor, and I'd love people's advice about that, right? Because all the students don't care about the same thing, and the weight of politics comes in there, and in this particular moment, it's really intense, and that kind of tension in the classroom that feels really emotional. It's hard.
And people's basic survival needs, right? Like people worry about getting food and having enough income to survive, and so people are in very different places in my classrooms. I would say a lot of my students have jobs. A lot of my students are stressed and overwhelmed with that, and have very little bandwidth to worry about climate change.
Thanks to you both. That's very helpful.
Thanks, Rich. Okay, Panu.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jen. The internet is a bit slow in Helsinki, so I'll keep the video off. But as you know, I really like the nuances that you are putting in this work, and there would be lots of things to comment, but I'll try to restrict myself to roughly 3 points. First, related to worry, I really like this hypothesis that you are working with objects of care and having some more pinpointing. And of course, this also brings us to the problems in language about emotions and feelings and different research traditions related to these issues, because some psychologists use the concept of worry in a sort of uncontrollable rumination sense. That could be avoided if we extend our vocabulary a bit more, and then at least add rumination, as you hinted in your work also. Well, I've done this work related to anxiety, and I think that we need several words for various aspects of anxiety, and this practical anxiety or practical eco-anxiety might be one of them. And perhaps something similar might be developed in relation to worry also. So at least a distinction between, uncontrollable, paralyzing kinds of rumination, and then a more concern-shaped worry, for example. But there's going to be battles to be fought with psychologists, for example. There's an interesting new proposal for a scale of climate change worry. I can share the link if somebody is interested. It's a bit too much related to weather events. That's my critique of the text, but it's an interesting piece. So I'll be shorter now with the 2 other points. The second one about classrooms, I think it's related to fear. It's tricky because transformative learning benefits from living through the emotions, but in many of our educational situations, we don't have really the tools that it would be ethical to lead people to actually experiencing fear or dread. Of course, it often lives in their bodies, this parasympathetic nervous system that Sarah hinted, that's one thing, and it's closely related to stress also. So at least, doing some bodily things may help. But this is something that I've also struggled with. One method that I've been using in relation to this spectrum line of ecological emotions activity is to talk in small groups about objects of fear and worry. So that uses a bit of intellectualization, but often it has been a very, very good result. So that allows people to dig a bit deeper at what are we actually afraid or worried about, but it's safer than living through those emotions. Since there's many people, including you, who have been doing research related to arts, I've often thought about dystopian films. As people have a certain set of limits within which they can then feel actually some part of the fear and dread. And then it's a complicated discussion about whether that's positive catharsis or whether that's problematic, because then you just can move on. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about this if you want to share. And then the third final point, we are preparing an article with some colleagues about this Finnish national survey of climate emotions. We managed to get 26 emotion or feeling words into that one. So it was interesting to explore how much people recognize them. So that's coming at some point. It may take a while, but just to mention that, and looking forward to reading Krista's and your work. So thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks for that link. I hadn't seen the climate change worry scale, but obviously that is right in my wheelhouse, or what I hope will become my wheelhouse is becoming my wheelhouse. I really enjoy these nuances that you're talking about. And that's amazing that you have 26 emotion words in a national survey. I don't know if Americans have that many emotion words. And maybe it's an English problem, right? Like our language is kind of impoverished when it comes to emotions. I don't know, but that's really interesting. And I do want to use your spectrum line activity, Panu. I just haven't gotten around to adapting it for online learning yet, but we did with these educators in these workshops this week. We had them excuse me, do a lot of sort of, stand by the fire image that speaks to you most, and stand by the, like move around the room and stand by the excerpt from Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass that, speaks to you the most. And so I think that once I get back into the real classroom, I plan to do some of what you're talking about there with worry. I don't know if there was an actual question. Oh, you were talking about film also, and immersing yourself in a film. And this is where I've learned a lot from my colleague Erin James about narrative theory and sort of cognitive, mental and emotional inhabiting of these story worlds. And so, yeah, I think that's, empirical eco-critics are doing some really interesting work, again, using kind of sociological methods to kind of glean how people are responding, right? And through surveys and interview data, it'd be great to have like fMRI or the mobile EEG or EEGs, right, that you can wear as you're doing these things. And this is stuff that I've talked about with some of my colleagues. We do have a psychologist who's kind of part of the Confluence Lab, but we haven't been able to bring her into any projects yet. So we have some ideas for kind of setting up some studies like that on our own here at University of Idaho. But I don't know if I'm answering your question, but that's what you made me think about. Yeah, Krista, did you want to add to that?
I just really have a question for this group, and I wonder if you all were signatories to the Scholars Warning Letter, and if you're noticing any pressure not to do this work, to not to, tread near possibilities of near-term social collapse, and a trend toward, staying in the techno-optimism realm, the Michael Mann's critique of Jim Bendel, like, oh, you doomers, like, do you get pressure not to do this?
I teach in Idaho, so that should answer that question. If you read this week's news about our state legislature reallocating funds from Boise State to a different institution because of people teaching social justice and other related things there, it's very frank. You can look that up. So yes. How about other people? Thanks, April. I'll talk to you soon, I hope.
Thank you all.
Could I jump in here?
Mm-hmm.
I'm Jean McGregor, now retired from teaching at the Evergreen State College in the graduate program of environmental studies, and also involved with leading a community of faculty, mostly in the Puget Sound region, but a little bit beyond, around sustainability and contemplative and reflective practices. So these are conversations we've been having for about 10 years. I think this is a huge faculty development opportunity laterally across the disciplines of our institutions, because literally dozens of us in any institution are teaching about really daunting challenges and complex problems right now, whether it's health inequities related to the pandemic or the heritage of institutional racism in our country, to the climate crisis. There's so many of us who are engaging students in very deep waters right now. And I believe, and I think a lot in our faculty community believe, that it's actually unethical to open up these Pandora's boxes without giving students tools and strategies and role models around solutions.
Mm-hmm.
Particularly in an intro environmental studies class, it's like, okay, climate change. Next week, we're going on to toxics, Think about the student response to this. It's just laying one layer on another. And so I think building communities of faculty to work on this together is just very, very important around not only individual actions, but collective action that we all can be taking. So I just want to leave it there, but I just think the opportunity to have more lateral interdisciplinary discussions with our colleagues on our campuses, many of us are wading more deeply into this water, and I think we can help each other find some creative solutions. And also raising with senior administrators, what is the social contract that we have with our communities and our students for this century?
Yeah. Thank you. That's so important. And this, I mean, gets back to kind of, I think, Sarah's challenge for us to be specific about what classrooms we're talking about, who are our students, you know, and I'm lucky to be teaching mostly upper division English major courses, not the 101 environmental studies course. And so in some ways, my students have self-selected into this, and I'm not sort of surprising them with the content and the emotions that come with that. But you're right. I mean, it's a great opportunity for supportive institutions to work with faculty to do some development work. And if you don't have a supportive institution, we'll do it ourselves, which is what I see us doing here in part. Anyone want to respond to Jean or Marek? Marek, are you next?
Yeah, thank you. So I want to follow up. So this is to Krista's question and what Jean said about sort of larger responsibility in our fields. So I'm a comparative literature scholar in English Lit, and my field is children's literature. And 2 years ago, I started looking, 3 years ago, I started looking at representations of climate change in literature for young people. And I realized that there is this incredible disproportion toward dystopia. And we have tons of books, studies of dystopia, and articles, of course, and most of these tend to represent dystopia as an adequate response to the challenges we're facing. And I saw in reactions of my students that this is not exactly what is happening on the ground, that students are overwhelmed by dystopia, especially Generation Z. So students who are in their mid-20s now, they pretty much grew up surrounded by dystopia, and they tend to assume that dystopia is the only literary formula in the way forward, that there is really no other options. So they've been conditioned by this larger dystopian narrative, which blinds them to see alternatives. And I have since been struggling to articulate alternative responses, one of which would be something that I called planetarianism. And this, I'm still sort of working on better articulations of this notion. But essentially it means, how do we create narratives which create hope for the planet, whatever this hope is? And the hope doesn't have to be a solution. It's an emotional position. And this has been really an uphill struggle. And I have seen a lot of resistance in my field. A lot of my friends in children's and young adult literature journals, they really have a sense that we've been doing enough. All of our, eco-criticism, ecofeminism, we're just really pushing forward. We're ahead of the curve. And I don't share this optimism. And I recently, with my graduate students, we did a review we looked at 9 key journals in the field of children's and young adult literature. All of the articles available on Muse, JSTOR, and whatnot. And out of close to 6,000 articles, we looked at close to 6,000 articles, and only 14 talk about climate change. So this is like some 99.7% of articles we have in our field completely ignore issues of climate change. And so this is like one quantifiable evidence that tells me that no, we have not been paying enough attention. We have not been doing this work well, and we don't even have the vocabulary, which is super important aspect to address these issues. So in this sense, there is a push from, at least in my field, a sense of sort of complacency that, yeah, we're doing this work well. And I just don't think this is the case. So this maybe adds to these emotional, emotional resistance to engage with climate change in these conversations.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. And it speaks to this tendency I think we have to think of emotions in binary terms, like either the future is going to be dystopian or it's going to be utopian, right? When that's not at all the case. We have a wide spectrum of possible future scenarios. And I would encourage you to find out, all of you, if you have geographers on campus who do scenario modeling or scenario building exercises, because I'm doing some really cool pedagogy this semester, which hasn't actually happened yet, which is why I'm not talking about it to you today, but we're doing a narrative, landscape architecture, and geography scenario building collaborative pedagogy experiment. And it's super cool. So I can talk about that another time maybe, or share details with you after we do it. But yeah, I think it's important not to reduce the future to either dystopian or something else. There's a wide, infinite variability of these possible worlds that we're going to be moving into, and that just knowing that, I think, helps give people a sense of empowerment and self-efficacy. But I think Andrew had his hand up. Do you have thoughts about that or something else?
I think I saw Andrew's hand up as well, and now I don't see him. I don't know if he had to hop out, but
okay.
I'd like to. I'm not Andrew, but close to that. I would like to jump in because I work in the children's lit and young adults narrative field, just as Merrick. And I've been working with dystopia, and my current project, as many of you already know, is on radical hope. So I would like to disagree with Merrick when he defines hope. And I think hope comes from, when I think of hope as radical hope, think of hope in the terms of Paulo Freire, is when you think that, when you look at your tools, your environment, your community, the network that sustains you, the network in the broadest sense, and you think that together, as what Jen, you just said, like collaborative pedagogy, for example, the things can be different. And I think that is hope. That's the type of hope that what sustains us. So what I'm working on is with those dystopian novels, that generation that Merrick is talking about is, I'm right now, I'm just drafting out the scripts for the workshops that we're going to have in reading or rereading the same dystopian novels that have sort of like made such an impression in this generation. How can we reread them generatively, read them again and read them differently, and see and find the threads of hope within them? And I think one of the things, one thing that contributes to that is that kind of like collaborative pedagogy, which, well, I'm thinking all the time on Paulo Freire. But it's how you set the class in that collaborative way, the workshop or wherever you're doing this. And just from that first example, and then thinking about it and discussing it and etc., then you start finding those threads of hope also, even in, maybe not the road, but even so in the road. So.
Thank you. That's amazing. And please do, share your work in progress with us. I'm excited about the radical hope angle. That's super interesting. I think Andrew did come back. Do you want to? Yeah, go ahead. I know some people might have to go, but I'm happy to stay.
Yeah. Hi, can you hear me? So I just got an appointment for my mom for a vaccine. So I had to, that's why I had to run off. So,
yeah, excellent.
So yeah, what was I going to say? Oh yeah. One thing, since someone mentioned the road, a couple people, road has been mentioned. I just wanted to throw out the book Parable of the Sower, which is a similarly sad and distressing read, but maybe has some hope in it that the road doesn't.
Yes,
and it also,
I kept that one.
Okay, cool. This is going back to integrating these emotions into environmental studies classes, and and other kind of courses. I was recent, and this isn't, I don't have much to say, except I was recently someone reached out to me who's teaching environmental studies class, who his students had organized around bringing these topics into the class. They were saying, we don't know what to do with these emotions, and we need an outlet for discussing them in the classroom. And so I'm going to be doing like a guest talk with them in a couple of weeks. But it just struck me that, I think this is bubbling up from not just the need for within professors who are not knowing how to handle this, but bubbling up from the students. And it just highlights to me how much of a need there is to integrate these types of conversations into the discussion. So yeah, that's all.
Thank you. Yeah, and it sounds like Krista's going to address some of this in a month, right? Or 2 months, April? What month are we in? That'll be great.
Krista, right now, I think we have you on for April 30th. So I'll follow up with everybody in the next couple of weeks, but make sure we have that time locked in.
Yeah. Thank you. All right, I've been saving the chat, and maybe I'll end the recording. Anything else? Any other comments, questions?